Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. This is once again the mobile edition of Dragonfly Spirit Studio, so please bear with me if the production quality isn't quite what you would expect from a studio video. Before we start on today's Postcard Paint-Along, I just want to share my excitement about our brand new theme music. So I didn't get to comment on this on the last video because the video portion had already been shot when the theme music was composed. But I just have to share how excited I am with our new theme music. I absolutely love it. It was composed by Theo Svano, who's been one of my watercolor students for a while, but he's also a very accomplished young musician. And he took on the task of writing some new theme music for us, and I absolutely love it. I hope you're enjoying it too. So in today's video, we're going to do another postcard paint-along, and this time we're going to tackle a situation of you're painting on location and you have a fairly complicated scene with lots of picture elements, lots of various things that you might include in your painting. And we're going to assume that we're working on a postcard. So one of the things that it's helpful to do when you're working on a postcard or a small sheet of paper on location is to take into account the fact that you only have a certain amount of time, you only have a certain amount of paper, you're working under more difficult conditions than in your studio. So maybe you don't want to put everything in. Now, perhaps you're planning to do a large painting that includes all the bells and whistles, but for what we're going to do on location, we'd be better off doing maybe even several small paintings and starting to get our head around it. Or you have to invest the time and the practice to become good at handling all those things in the field on the fly in a short period of time with the wind blowing. And that takes time and practice and devotion. If you really want that to be your ultimate goal, to paint under those conditions, more complicated paintings, it really does take years of practice. And it doesn't help to start with the most complicated thing because then you just get discouraged. So let's assume that we're not at that point. I know I'm not. And let's think about the process of picking out a few things where we can practice a little bit of what we'd need to do a bigger painting of this scene and still get a nice little postcard and still learn something and finish in the length of time that we have allotted and not have to use teeny little brushes to paint microscopic sized rocks and features in our painting, but to be able to just focus on a few things at a time. So we're going to do a painting that tries to capture the feeling of this stormy day on a rocky beach, but we're not going to try to reproduce the whole scene. So let's get started with our postcard paint-along of a stormy day at the beach. I like to think to myself, what could I write on a postcard? Maybe 3 sentences? So there's not a whole lot that I could say in words on a postcard. So I want to try to also not try to say too much in images on a postcard. So I'm going to take some time to think to myself what my main impressions were about this day, or are if I'm standing in the scene, even better. It was a pretty breezy day. The air was kind of cool. There was a lot of surf. This view is from fairly high up, so the waves don't look very big, but they were pretty big. There's a storm coming in. There's a storm that just went out. It's kind of a dramatic day with the light and with the surf and the spray. So what I want to capture is some of that light, some of the clouds and the dramatic light, and then that contrast of some of the big rocks, maybe not all of them, probably only 1 or 2 of them, and then the feeling of the surf and the light on the surf. So that's what I have in my mind to try to capture. So I'm going to just get some sky. I'm going to get maybe 1 or 2 of the rocks, and I'm going to get a feeling of surf coming in. And that's all I'm after. So I need to make that horizon line. There's that white edge on the horizon. And instead of masking things when I'm in the field, I like to use the same little spray method that we used with the moon postcard paint-along that we did recently. So if you haven't seen that, you might want to watch that one too. But what I'm going to do is take another postcard that has a nice straight edge, or anything else that has a straight edge, and figure out where I want my horizon. And I think I'm going to do kind of a low horizon because I want to emphasize that sky. And I'm going to, as I did before, use a misting spray bottle to mist right along that horizon line, and then lift this off before it has a chance to crawl underneath that edge. And if I had been smart, I would have had my color mixed ahead of time. So let me quickly mix my nice dramatic gray from ultramarine blue and burnt umber here. Oh, it's good that you can see that I make the same silly mistakes that we all make. It's not just you. All right, so I have a nice dramatic gray here, and I'm going to just lay my brush on its side and start sweeping along. I'm not worrying too much about, it's not quite as gray as I'd like. I'm not worrying too much about trying to capture exactly the sky that I had. I'm trying to capture a bit of that feel of dramatic light. So that sky was dark by the horizon, and I'm not trying to paint right up to that line. I'm letting the water bring the paint up to the horizon line. And that way I don't have to be so careful with my brush. And I also get a little bit of softness at the horizon, which is going to be helpful for conveying that feeling of rough water. So there we go with our sky. I might want to drop a little more dark color right in here under these clouds. Make that nice and dramatic. All right, and we'll run it just a little bit. I think I will blot up a little of this that's run off on the side so I don't drag my hand through it. And maybe run a little off here too, just mostly so I don't do something silly and smear it right across the page. All right, now to make my surf, I'm again going to put my brush on the side, and I'm going to practice this on another piece of paper. I want to sort of dry brush, so I don't want this much moisture probably on my brush. So I'm going to test and see, that gives me more like what I want. And now I'm going to move my brush in kind of an oval shape here. And then as I go farther back, I'm now pressing my brush down a little bit more to make that intermediate. And then remember, there was that light at the horizon, so let's just dry brush some linear strokes there. And then in the foreground, it's like I'm sweeping up into those waves. I'm not necessarily painting waves, I'm just trying to suggest. And now in the foreground, more of where they come in onto the beach. So does that look exactly like waves? Of course not. Do I care? No. And now, while this is still wet, let me drop in some darker color. If you want to shape a little bit of your waves at this point, you could do that. So this is a postcard, remember? I'm not trying to say everything. I don't have to be horribly eloquent. I'm just capturing the idea of it. The feel of the day, that's what I'm trying to capture. Now, in this area where it comes into the sand, let me get a little bit more brown color. Kind of pale. And just suggest that color change that occurs as you get in towards the beach. All right. Now, I need to let this dry before I paint in my rocks. So we'll set this aside, maybe start another one, try some more and see if I can get waves that I like better, or fiddle with it and see if you can wreck it, which is what I would probably do. I'm thinking, wonder what would happen if I tried to create some intentional blooms in here. Would that work to help suggest waves? Postcard's a great place to experiment because, you know, I have very little time or materials invested now. So if I do wreck it, not a big deal. I actually kind of like that. So we'll let this dry and then we'll come back and put in our big rocks. Okay, our initial washes have dried and we're ready to put in our rocks. And I'm going to use a technique that if you've been watching these postcard paintings, you've seen me use this before. I've got a piece of plastic wrap and I'm going to mix some nice dark gray. Oops, wrong color. With ultramarine blue and burnt umber. You can also use ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, or cobalt blue and burnt umber, or cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Now, I want that sort of triangular shape of the rock. So what I'm going to do is fold my plastic wrap so that I get that kind of rocky, pointy rock shape. And I'm not really worried about trying to get exactly any of these rocks. I'm just trying to get that kind of rock that we have. So I'm going to fold it, and then I'm going to put some paint on it. And I'm going to find where I'd like to have my rock, maybe right here, and press it down. Now, this isn't going to give me the entire rock, but it's going to give me texture so that when I do paint over this and paint my entire rock, I'll have this subtle sort of variation underneath that. So this needs to dry. While that's drying, I can put in some of my small rocks out here. Make that one come up above the horizon. So I'm not worried about whether this is exactly like the rocks that were there, unless you're doing something where it's a very recognizable, famous rock and you really want it to match, in which case you could use a pencil to draw your shape of your rocks and make sure you had them looking like the rocks that are there. And now I think I will dry my brush just a bit and add a little bit of dark to the water near those rocks, like that. And then this is going to be my big rock, and that dries pretty quickly, so let's see. I'm just kind of using what the stamp gave me as the shape of my rock. And I think I'll let a little bit of that light stay, like some spots where there's a little highlight on there. And now as I come down to the water, let's again kind of dry brush, drag the brush, and give the suggestion that some of this is splashing up against that rock. Doing just a little bit of, adding just a little bit of dark there at the base of that rock. Now, having done that, I feel like I need to darken a little bit down here. So I'm going to take my brush and just add a little bit of darker color in the foreground. Let's let that dry and see what we think. All right, that layer is dry. Let's have a look and see what we think. I'm going to give you a little bit of a closer look at that subtle texture from the stamping. And I think I want this area turned out a little darker, which is nice. It matches these rocks a little better. And I think I actually want to add a bit more to have sort of a shadowy side to that rock. And also to help kind of define it from the background. So I'm going to just add a little bit more color here. And then to give it that rockiness, I'm going to drag that inner edge with my finger. And I think I'll add a little more color down here at the bottom and do the same thing. Just kind of soften up. I use my finger to soften edges quite a lot. And then with that darker value, I feel like I still need a little bit of a darker value down here to sort of lead the eye. So I'm just going to make a couple of little kind of calligraphic strokes, like the shadowing that you might have where some water has run up on the beach. And I think I'll call that done. Let's take the tape off and let this area dry and see what we think of it. All right, time to take off the tape. As I mentioned on an earlier postcard paint-along, if you kind of pull at a 45-degree angle, you'll be a little less likely to tear the paper. If you still are having trouble with tearing, try warming up the tape, which softens the adhesive. So take a blow dryer and warm up that tape, and the adhesive will soften up and you'll be able to pull it off, even if it's super sticky tape. So I'm pretty happy with that. It does not look like the scene. I'm not trying to paint how the scene looks. I'm trying to paint how the scene feels. And it does very much have that feel of the day to me. So I'm pretty happy with this. Also, although we had to wait for it to dry from time to time, the actual amount of work involved in painting this was relatively small. So what I do when I'm out in the field is I take a lot of small painting supports, usually pieces of cardboard that I've covered with packing tape, and I'll do a half a dozen of these so that while one is drying, I just start on the next one. They all come out different because I'm painting them very loosely and in a very relaxed way, but they all give me a chance to practice technique, and they give me the feeling of the day, even though I'm not trying to paint exactly the scene that I'm seeing. For me, this is about as accurate as if I were to have written a postcard to someone and said, oh, it was a day where there was a storm coming in and there was a lot of surf and these big rocks. It was really dramatic. This says that. And so I'm happy with it. As a postcard, I think it's great. Write a little note on the back, send it off to somebody. They'll be delighted. So this is a great way for you to practice, and you can practice lots of different ways for making waves. You can practice ways to make clouds, practice ways to make rocks, but keep it simple. Instead of trying to do the whole complicated scene, do little bits of it, little snippets of it, and allow yourself to practice and enjoy yourself. And you'll learn more. You'll get a half a dozen great little postcards you can send off, and then you can take what you learned and go back to your studio and do a bigger painting with some techniques in your arsenal that will work to give you the look that you want. So have fun with it, happy painting, and I'll see you next time.